Brian Hampton. I'm a professor here in the English department, and on behalf of the C.S. Lewis Lecture Committee, and in gratitude to our partners, the McClellan Foundation, the Generosity Trust, Covenant College, I want to welcome you to the 33rd Annual C.S. Lewis Lecture. Following the lecture, we will enjoy a short time of Q&A with our speaker, and I'll allow him to field his own questions. But speak up. This is designed to project that way, rather than this way. The C.S. Lewis Lectureship was established in Chattanooga to perpetuate Lewis's distinguished academic and Christian ecumenical accomplishments. Over the years, the committee has sought scholars whose work accords with the spirit of C.S. Lewis's own vocation as a teacher, devoted to the care of his pupils' minds and souls, as well as his legacy as a literary critic, children's author, Christian apologist, and popular philosopher and theologian. Tonight's speaker articulates well Lewis's legacy, now half a century in the making. Dr. Michael Ward is Senior Research Fellow at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford, a center for the study of theology and philosophy in the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas. Since 2013, he has also taught at Houston Baptist University as Professor of Apologetics. Previously, he served as the chaplain of St. Peter's College, Oxford, as well as the warden and curator of the Kilns, C.S. Lewis's resident home in Oxford. In addition to being the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, Professor Ward also has an illustrious career as a movie extra in several films. And he's also the author of Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, about which he will be saying more in a moment. In 1944, Lewis delivered a paper to the Oxford Socratic Club entitled Is Theology Poetry?, where he remarks, man is a poetical animal and touches nothing which he does not adorn. Lewis applies this axiom to the way we think about politics, scientism, philosophy, theology, or cosmology, all of which become, in his words, poetries to their own believers. That is, adherents find deep satisfaction in the world picture these poetries have to offer, with some of that satisfaction derived from the pleasure of its aesthetics, and some derived from the gravity of its concepts. The medieval mind adopted and rejoiced in the beauty, gravity, and poetry of its earth-centered model of the universe, a geocentric system which featured the other planets and spheres rotating concentrically in dancing unity about our fixed planet. This harmony was understood to communicate the perfection of the God who created them, in a system moved by and directed towards divine love. But even after this model was proved to be inaccurate by Copernicus in 1543, many persisted in the model because of the beauty and gravity of its poetry. And Lewis was one of them. And that's the subject of tonight's lecture. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Michael Ward.
The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Those are the opening verses of Psalm 19. C.S. Lewis, pictured here on the cover of Time magazine in the 1940s, described Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the finest lyrics in the world. And it's about Lewis's understanding of the heavens, and in particular the medieval understanding of the seven heavens, which Brian just mentioned, that I want to speak to you tonight. And in particular, how I believe that the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos provide Lewis's imaginative blueprint for the seven chronicles of Narnia. These books, published one per year from 1950 to 1956, are some of the best-selling and most influential books of the second half of the 20th century. They are still selling millions of copies worldwide annually in over 40 different languages. They've recently been introduced to a whole new generation of readers thanks to the not very good movie adaptations. And it's about these books that I want to speak to you tonight. If I could see you, I would ask you how many of you have read at least one of these books. Ah, thank you, that's better. Yes. Read at least one of these books or seen at least one of the movies. Does that increase the numbers? A little. Okay, that's a pretty high response rate, thank you. Not many series of books you could ask that question about and get such a positive answer to. But I wonder if you've ever sat back from your enjoyment of these books and asked yourself why Lewis wrote them the way that he did. When Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to his great friend J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien hated what he heard. Did you know this? Tolkien strongly detested the way Lewis assembled The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe out of what he regarded as incompatible mythological traditions. English children, centaurs and fauns from Greek and Roman mythology, a white witch character who seems to have stepped out of the pages of Hans Andersen, Father Christmas, for goodness sake, what's he doing in the story? Tolkien thought this was an abomination. He couldn't stand it, and he soon gave up trying to read the books after they began to be published. He later confessed that they were entirely outside his range of imaginative sympathy. And because Tolkien has become so famous, his attitude to Narnia has become very well known too, and lots of people, thinking that Tolkien knew the books actually rather intimately, when he didn't at all, have assumed that Tolkien knew what he was talking about and have assessed the Narnia Chronicles in a very similar fashion, dismissing the series as a hodgepodge, a mishmash, thrown together without any very obvious coherent pattern or design. The only problem with that attitude is that it's not at all characteristic of C.S. Lewis, who was a very rigorous and consistent thinker and didn't do anything by accident. One of his close friends, Owen Barfield, once said of C.S. Lewis that what he thought about everything was somehow secretly present in what he said about anything. Lewis's poetry is fantastically complex. Mind-bogglingly complex, actually. You look at some of Lewis's poems, you think you've worked out their rhyme scheme and their meter. You look more closely and a whole other dimension of complexity reveals itself beneath the one you first noticed. He said he was enamored of metrical and phonetic subtleties, and the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all. Lewis loved studying the writings of medieval and Renaissance authors, who, he said, love to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these authors, he says, but often by very intricate paths. Complexity, he says, is a mark of the medieval mind. These writers present us often with a work which at first looks planless, though all is planned. And as a Christian, Lewis believed that the universe itself is a fantastically intricate work of divine artistry. Every single thing in creation has been made for a purpose, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect, as he puts it in his book on prayer. God is working his purposes out, though we may not be able to discern the pattern, the design. The divine author knows precisely what he is about. And one day, God willing, it may make better sense to us. So you look at Lewis's complex poetry, you look at his love of complex medieval writings, you look at his beliefs about God's complex artistry in creation, and then you turn back to Narnia and its supposed hodgepodge nature, and you ask yourself, this is unlikely, isn't it? Lots of Lewis scholars and critics have come to that conclusion, that there seems to be a bit of a mismatch between the common dismissal of Narnia as a mishmash and what we know of Lewis as a writer with a keen interest in complexity and intricacy. And so they've gone looking for an additional level of significance within these books which might tie the series together a bit more satisfactorily. And the obvious place to look, of course, is the biblical parallels within the series, because Lewis once said that the whole Narnia series is about Christ. The whole Narnia series is about Christ, he said. And the Christ character, Aslan, the Lion King, is indeed the only character who appears in all 7 books, and he is indeed very Christ-like, especially in these 3 stories. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he is the Redeemer. In The Magician's Nephew, he's the Creator. In The Last Battle, he's the Judge. The biblical parallels in these 3 tales are very obvious, and you can't miss them. But they're only 3 out of 7 books, less than half the series. What about the other 4 books? When you look at these 4, you might have expected Lewis to do a similar sort of thing, a similar sort of reimagining of major elements or episodes of Christ's life and ministry and office. A whole Narnia story about Aslan's nativity, about his being born into Narnia as a lion cub. You might have expected that, a Narnian Christmas story. You don't get that. You don't get a Narnian Ascension story. You don't get a Narnian Pentecost, which you might possibly have expected given what Lewis has done in these 3. But in these 4, what do you have? You find Aslan entering the story of Prince Caspian amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. In The Dawn Treader, Aslan is seen flying in a sunbeam. In The Silver Chair, Aslan doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all. He's confined to his own high country above the clouds, which doesn't seem a very Christian way of depicting your Christ character if he's up in heaven but not incarnated into the world. And in The Horse and His Boy, Aslan's mistaken for 2 lions, or maybe 3 lions, and he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You remember how he says there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. Okay, why has Lewis decided to make his Christ character swift of foot? I don't recall Jesus in the New Testament having a very notable ministry to athletes or being a great sprinter. Why would Lewis do that? It's a question worth asking, maybe. So, when we approach the Narnia Chronicles from this biblical perspective, trying to find a pattern, a coherent design that overarches all 7 books, we don't fare very much better than we fared when we addressed the Chronicles simply as works of literature, drawing upon literary and mythological traditions. And yet we still have this very obvious and inescapable fact of Lewis's keen interest in complexity and intricacy. And that has caused Lewis scholars and critics to go looking for an additional level of significance within the series that might tie the series together a bit better. All sorts of different theories have been suggested, such as the 7 deadly sins, the 7 sacraments, the 7 traditional virtues, the 7 books of Spenser's Fairy Queen, the 7 dwarfs. No, only joking about that. I myself once made a half-hearted attempt to link the Chronicles to different plays by Shakespeare. But I soon abandoned that idea. You know, as a literary critic, when you are trying to crowbar books into a grid of your own devising, this idea worked quite well for 3 or 4 of the Chronicles, but not so well for the others. And it was when I wasn't looking for it that I believe I stumbled across the real answer to this imaginative puzzle that the Narnia books present. I was halfway through my PhD researches at the time, and one night I was reading a poem that Lewis wrote when an idea occurred to me, and I will come back to that idea later on in the talk. I took my idea to my PhD supervisors. They encouraged me to explore it. I finished my PhD on that very topic. I eventually wrote up my findings with this book published by Oxford University Press, Planet Narnia. The BBC then got interested and commissioned a television documentary about it called The Narnia Code. And there's now a book of the same title. The Narnia Code is a shorter, simpler version of Planet Narnia. And I'm glad to say that copies of Planet Narnia are available outside afterwards at a very reasonable price. And it's the substance of these books that I want to share with you tonight, if I may. But it's a very big claim that I'm making, that Lewis had a secret and intentional design to the Narnia Chronicles which he told nobody about, which nobody noticed for 50, 60 years until I came along and spotted it in 2003. Now, this is a very arrogant claim, a very egotistical claim, you might say, and you would be right to be skeptical about it. I myself would be skeptical if anybody came to me with such a preposterous claim. But hear me out, if you will. Listen to the evidence, or at least some of the evidence, as much of the evidence as I can cram into 50 minutes, and see whether it doesn't begin to stack up. Still, it is a big claim, and you'd be right to be skeptical. And so before I come on to the substance of the argument itself, let me try and disarm some of that skepticism by giving you 5 background reasons why Lewis might do such a thing. When we have these background building blocks in place, we will discover that this sort of thing is not so uncharacteristic, so unlikely after all. We shouldn't just allow Lewis to do this. Really, we should expect him to do it. So, of these 5 background reasons, the first is Lewis himself and his own temperament, his own character. He could be very secretive when he wanted to be. George Sayer, who knew Lewis for 30 years, wrote a very good biography of him called Jack, The Life and Times of C.S. Lewis. You know that Lewis didn't like the name Clive, and he liked the name Staples even less, so he was always known as Jack. George Sayer says in that biography that Jack never ceased to be secretive. Jack never ceased to be secretive. And the most obvious example of his secretiveness is the fact that when he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year. Have you seen the film Shadowlands? Do you know about this part of Lewis's life? He got married and he told nobody for the best part of a year, not even close friends like Tolkien. A man who can keep his marriage secret can keep almost anything secret. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many important things that one of his friends jokingly said it should not have been called Surprised by Joy, it should have been called Suppressed by Jack. This is the man we're dealing with. Of course, it proves nothing about Narnia. I'm not saying that because Lewis had a secret marriage that therefore there's a secret to Narnia. I'm just saying this is the kind of man that we're dealing with. That's the psychological background point. He could keep secrets when he wanted to. From psychology, we turn to epistemology. Epistemology is the study of consciousness, the science of how we know things. And Lewis once said that an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. An influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. Let me very quickly summarize for you his understanding of consciousness before we go on. Lewis divided consciousness into 2 modes, enjoyment and contemplation. And he writes about these in a little article called Meditation in a Tool Shed, where he pictures himself standing in the darkness of his tool shed one sunny day, and a beam of light is slanting down through the darkness of the shed, lighting up little particles of dust and falling on the floor. This image of the beam, looked at from the side, becomes Lewis's picture of one kind of conscious knowing that we have. He calls it contemplation, looking at from the outside in a neutral, detached, disinterested fashion. Then he shifts his position so that the beam of light is no longer falling on the floor, but is now falling directly on his eyes. And instantly, he said, the whole picture changed. He no longer saw the tool shed, he no longer even saw the beam of light, because he now saw along the beam of light. By looking along it, he saw the crack at the top of the door, the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside, and millions of miles away, the sun itself. This is his image of the second kind of consciousness that we have. He calls it enjoyment, looking along the beam, the sort of knowledge you have of a thing when you are committed to it. You inhabit it. You're not holding it at arm's length, you're bringing it close. Our whole conscious life, he says, operates in one or other of these 2 modes. You can't do them both at the same time. You can alternate very rapidly between them, but you can't do them simultaneously. And the interesting thing is that when you look along the beam vanishes. It's no longer the object of your vision, it's now the medium of your vision. Light is not so much something we see as it is something we see by, Lewis says. The distinction is very similar to the distinction in languages like Spanish and French between saber and connaître, between savoir and connaître. Knowledge about something from the outside, knowledge of something from the inside. And the knowledge of something from the inside is the deeper kind of knowledge. So when Lewis says an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep, what he means is an influence which can't evade our contemplative consciousness won't go very deep. For as long as we're just inspecting something from a distance, looking at it externally, neutrally, we won't have a deep knowledge of it. It needs to get beneath the radar of our contemplation and sink down into enjoyment for us to get the deeper kind of knowledge. Lewis says in this essay that really we should try out every question that presents itself to us in both modes, seeing which one works better. He says we should be like the ancient Persians who debated everything twice, once when they were sober and once when they were drunk. There are benefits to our knowledge of being drunk, of being disinhibited, of not trying to be cool and detached, but committing yourself. Then you have the deeper kind of knowledge. But it involves a kind of invisibility. The beam vanishes when you look along it. That's our second background point. Thirdly, a theological background point. Lewis was interested in this verse from Colossians. For all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together. He paraphrased this verse as Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Now, he says that the whole Narnia series is about Christ. When we hear him say that, we immediately think of Aslan, don't we? The particular Christ-like character who does Christ-like things. We don't tend to think of this aspect of Christ, the cosmic Christ, the omnipresent Christ. And yet this is an equally important part of the biblical picture. How would Lewis get this aspect of Christ into the Narnia Chronicles if he was trying to depict this discarnate Christ, so to speak, as well as the incarnate Christ? He would really need to do both kinds if he was going to have a fully orbed scriptural presentation of Christ's nature. This aspect of Christ is somewhat difficult for us to conceptualize because so often when we think of conceptualizing, we think of contemplating. We think of stepping outside the beam. But of course, we cannot do this with Christ in this cosmic sense because all things hold together in Christ, including our very understanding of Christ. There is no Christ-less vantage point into which we can step and from which we can turn back and survey this Christ-drenched universe. To try to find a Christless vantage point is to step into the void. And this puts us into something of a predicament, which Lewis homes in on in his book Miracles. He says, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, i.e. God, Christ, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one that is most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. And that is exactly how the supernatural, the divine, has been forgotten. In other words, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. God is this side of knowing. God is the very ground of our ability to know anything whatsoever. Before we know anything, we know God. By acquaintance, by enjoyment. But something which is everywhere might as well be nowhere, because you have no negative with which to contrast your positive experience of the thing. So that is the third background point. The fact that God is, in a sense, invisible to us in this particular sense by virtue of his ubiquity, by virtue of his omnipresence. We can only know God in this sense through enjoyment, not through contemplation. Only by looking along the beam of this Christ-drenched universe can we know it. There is no other position for us. The fourth background point is a literary point. Lewis once wrote an essay called The Kappa Element in Romance. Kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, which means cryptic or hidden. And romance here means story, an adventure story, a fairy tale. So the title of his essay could be translated, The Hidden Element in Story. Lewis wrote an essay with the title, The Hidden Element in Story. This should alert us to the possibility that there may be more going on in Narnia than meets the eye. Most people, however, don't know about this essay because he never published it under this title. He later wrote it up and published it under a different title, On Stories, and in On Stories he says this, to be stories at all, stories must be series of events. But it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or a quality. So the best kind of stories are not just a sequence of events, not just a plot, but also a qualitative thing. They have atmosphere, they have weather. The deathliness of Hamlet is one of Lewis's examples. A bad story, like The Three Musketeers, is all plot and no atmosphere. In The Three Musketeers, the characters go from London to Paris, and there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. Your nose is kept ruthlessly to the grindstone of the plot, Lewis says. Rather like those movies you see, which are full of car chases and explosions and shootouts. It's all terribly exciting, high-octane action. But where's the character? Where's the sense of place? Where's the atmosphere? Think about it, actually, in connection with movie-going. You sometimes are in the movie theatre, aren't you? And you are bored by the movie. You lose attention. And you sit back in your seat, and the frame of the screen becomes visible to you. And you realize, oh, I'm in the movie theatre. But while the film has your attention, you, as it were, pass through the screen and you move about in the world of the movie. You forget that there is a screen, that there is a frame of the screen. So by the magic of good movie making, something disappears. There is a cryptic element. Likewise, in a well-told tale in a book, you're not contemplating the deathliness of Hamlet while you read that play. Only when you close the play and reflect upon it afterwards, only after you leave the theatre and reflect upon it afterwards, may you think of the deathliness which is cleverly woven by Shakespeare into every part of the story. The black clothes of Hamlet, the soliloquies about suicide, the death wish, the drowning of Ophelia, the graveyard scene. It all conspires to evoke this sense of mortality. But while you're living the story, you're living the story. You're not reflecting upon it. It becomes invisible to you because you look along it, you don't look at it. So you see here how we have a literary equivalent of enjoyment consciousness. That's the fourth background point. Now, fifthly, transferred classicism. This is a term that Lewis coined in writing a review of the Oxford Book of Christian Verse. He says that Christian poets up until the 17th century would often reach back into the classical past. They would find pagan gods and goddesses, Venus, Zeus, Jupiter, whoever it may be. They would take those deities, they would transfer them into their Christian poetry, and under the veil of those pagan gods and goddesses, they would say something about Christianity. God, the Christian God, Lewis says, often appears in medieval literature, but incognito, veiled, behind a mask, dressed up. Paganism, Lewis says, is the religion of poetry at this period, through which the author can express at any moment just so much or so little of his real religion, of his real Christianity, as his art requires. And everyone is in the secret. Everybody knew that this was what was going on. This wasn't a throwback to paganism. It was paganism in the service of Christian art. Think of St. Paul's example on the Areopagus, where he preaches to the men of Athens, saying, God is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. He's quoting here poems about Zeus. In Zeus we live and move and have our being, for we are indeed Zeus's offspring. That's what the original said. Poems by Aratus and Epimenides, Greek pagan poets. And Paul takes this presentation of Zeus, he transfers it into his presentation of the gospel. Somewhat similarly, the medieval writers also used paganism in the service of a Christian message. So those are our 5 background points, and we are now back where we started. Let's quickly recap what we have seen. We have seen that Lewis could be very secretive when he wanted to be. We have seen that his whole understanding of consciousness involves a kind of invisibility. When you enjoy something, you look along it, you don't look at it. There is a theological equivalent of enjoyment consciousness in the very omnipresence of Christ in the universe. There is a literary equivalent of enjoyment consciousness in the pervasive atmosphere or flavor or quality of a well-told tale. And then there is hiding God behind a pagan mask in transferred classicism. Those are our 5 background points, and we can now proceed. And at this point, it's worth reminding ourselves that although Lewis is best known for the Narnia books, he wasn't professionally a writer of fiction. He was professionally, of course, an academic, and the biggest book he ever wrote was this, English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. Snappy title, I always think. Can I do a quick survey, please? Ask you, how many of you have read this book? Is someone tentatively putting up a sheepish half hand? Thank you, ma'am. Good. How interesting. That's almost the mirror image of the earlier survey. You had nearly all read Narnia. Nearly all of you have not read this. And yet this, Lewis described as the top tune. It took him 15 years to write, and he said when he published it in 1954 that it was the top tune all those years, and all the other books he published during that decade and a half were just its little twiddly bits, which means the early Narnia Chronicles, Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce were just the little twiddly bits upon this massive intellectual enterprise. This is the main theme of Lewis's work. This is what he was paid to think about. It was part of this multi-volume series of books about literature called The Oxford History of English Literature, or Oh Hell, as Lewis called it. This is his Oh Hell volume. I think he sometimes regretted taking on this huge commission. But if you ever do read this book, and I would encourage you to do so, it's a very readable account, you will find that it opens with a long discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century thanks to Nicholas Copernicus, who, as Brian mentioned in his introduction, revolutionized astronomy in 1543 with his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, theorizing that we live in a heliocentric, a sun-centered cosmos, not in an earth-centered cosmos. And Lewis was interested in the Copernican revolution because he wanted to see how it played out in the literature of his chosen specialized field. Because, of course, the kind of cosmos you believe yourself to be living in will have a major impact upon the kinds of story that you write about yourself and your place in the world. So Copernicus is kind of a big deal. Lewis certainly thought so. And he returns to it in his last academic book, The Discarded Image. 3 times in this book, Lewis encourages his readers to take a walk under the sky at night, looking up at the sky at night as if they believed in the pre-Copernican model of the cosmos, as if they believed that the Earth was indeed central and static. These days, you look up into the night sky, you think you're looking up into empty space. But the word space didn't exist back before the time of Copernicus. It's a 17th century word in that sense. You could not have looked up into space before Copernicus. You would have looked up into the heavens, a series of ranked, concentric heavens or spheres, each sphere with its own planet and each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the earth. The first of these heavens was that of the moon, then that of Mercury, then Venus. You may recall in 2 Corinthians how St. Paul talks of a man in Christ who is taken up to the 3rd heaven. This idea of a series of ranked heavens exists in Jewish cosmology, both before and after the time of Christ. It's not just a medieval invention. Above the 3rd heaven is the brightest heaven of invention, as Shakespeare calls it, the sun's sphere. Then that of Mars, then Jupiter, and finally in the 7th heaven, Saturn. Still today, occasionally you hear people saying, "Oh, I was in the 7th heaven of delight." Why is it delightful to be in the 7th heaven? Because up there you are furthest away from earth and all its trials and tribulations. Go further through the sphere of the fixed stars. These are the planets, the wandering stars. Keep going through the sphere of the fixed stars, and you will eventually emerge into the home of God itself. You will escape the created order altogether. This is a more detailed diagram of that cosmological system as it was believed to be. And this was hard, reliable, scientific, established fact until the Copernican revolution. This is the image of the cosmos that we have discarded. That's why Lewis calls his book The Discarded Image. We no longer believe in this. Not that we have discarded it in every respect, we have retained it at least in one respect, because it is, of course, from these 7 heavens that we name the days of the week. It's slightly hidden from us in English because 4 of the days take their names from the Roman gods, from the Norse gods, rather than from the Roman ones. But if you think of it in Spanish, it's a little clearer. We have mainly discarded this image, but Lewis wanted to keep it alive in the minds of his students and his readers because, of course, this image of the cosmos is everywhere presupposed in medieval literature. Let me give you 2 examples, Dante and Chaucer. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens in his ascent to God's throne. Here is an illustration from an edition of the Divine Comedy showing you the planets in the order of the days of the week. So here on the left you have the sun for Sunday in his burning fiery chariot. Here we have the moon in her silvery gown holding a crescent for Monday. Tuesday, Mars with his helmet and his chainmail, the god of war. Then Mercury, we know he's Mercury because he's got wings on his heels. Mercury the messenger, swift of foot. Here we have Jupiter. The rod over his shoulder is not just any old stick, but a scepter, the royal staff of office, because Jupiter is associated above all things with kingliness, monarchy, royalty. Then we come to Venus with her green gown, because Venus is associated with fertility, creativity, sexuality, love. Traces of Venus's influence linger in our language. When we talk about venerating someone, lovingly respecting someone, we are doing something under the influence of Venus. When we contract a venereal disease, likewise, we are doing something under Venus, which we probably shouldn't be doing. And finally, Saturn with his sickle, cutting people down, because Saturn is associated with death, disaster, and all bad things. So Dante uses this old scheme very explicitly in the Divine Comedy. Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, is another man who uses it all over the place. And here's a page of notes I found in Lewis's handwriting. This is from Lewis's Complete Chaucer. He's making notes about the Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. You see the Knight's Tale at the top of the page there. And Lewis admired the way that Chaucer not only put the planetary characters into the Knight's Tale as actors in the drama, but he wove the influences, the appropriate influences of the planets into the plot, so that the climax of the Knight's Tale happens on Tuesday, Martes. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this academic, literary, historical love of the planets and the medieval cosmos. He also responds to it much more devotionally and spiritually as a Christian. We have already talked about his love of the 19th Psalm, the heavens are telling the glory of God. And he was a keen amateur astronomer too. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He enjoyed a trip to the local observatory. He would often point out unusual conjunctions of the planets in the night sky to his friends. We know this from his conversations in his letters. He was a keen amateur astronomer. He also responded to this scheme imaginatively and uses it very explicitly in that trilogy of novels he wrote during the Second World War. Out of the Silent Planet is the first of these 3 books, set on Mars, a very medieval Mars. The second book is set on Venus, and in the third book, the planetary powers actually come down to Earth to bring about the end of the story. It's all very obvious and explicit in the trilogy, you can't miss it. Why was Lewis so interested in these planets? He says this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn, we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Jupiter? No small claims, these. He's not saying this old scheme is just for the medievals. No, it has a continuing relevance for us too. Indeed, it's especially worthwhile in our own generation. Why? Well, because of what he says about Saturn. Of Saturn, we know more than enough. We know more than enough about the guy with the sickle cutting people down in their prime because Lewis's generation was the generation that went through the Great War. Lewis himself had been a teenage officer during the First World War. He'd been very nearly killed in the spring of 1918 when a shell fell in his trench, killing the man next to him, spattering him, Lewis, full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in the 1914-18 war. Of Saturn and his sickle, we know more than enough. But who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Jupiter, the king with the scepter? The Saturnine shadow cast over Lewis's contemporaries was not an eternal truth about the nature of the universe. It was a historical accident. And a much better way of symbolizing the heart of spiritual reality, as far as Lewis was concerned, was through the symbolism of Jove, Jupiter, the magnanimous, tranquil, festive Jupiter, the king. That's why it's especially important. We needn't fixate upon Saturn, as so many people did in the 1920s and 30s. Lewis refers to the culture of those decades as Saturnocentric, endlessly revolving around themes of pessimism and loss and cynicism. Think of Eliot's Wasteland, a heap of broken images. Understandable, given the trauma of the Great War. But Saturn is only one of 7 spiritual symbols. There are other ways of interpreting reality, and Jupiter is the best of them. So, when Lewis comes to write the Narnia Chronicles, I believe he uses this 7-fold scheme again. He had used it explicitly in the trilogy. Here in Narnia, he uses it implicitly. He takes each planet one by one and turns it into a story. He takes the influences, the attributes, the characteristics of one of the 7 heavens, and he makes out of it a whole tale. He uses it to control the way Aslan is portrayed. He uses it to control the way the children interact with Aslan. He uses it to control all sorts of ornamental and incidental details in each story as well. We don't have time to go through all 7, but let me spend some time on just the first 3 books in the order of publication. And that means we start out, very appropriately, with Jupiter. Who does not need to be reminded of Jove? Here is the planet Jupiter, and here in the southeast corner you can just make out Jupiter's great red spot, the great eye of Jupiter, which is a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter. The diameter of that spot is greater than the diameter of Earth. You could fit the whole of our planet inside that circle. Shows you how massive Jupiter is. That is the planet, and here we have Jupiter, the king of the gods. Jupiter in Roman, Zeus in Greek, and Thor in Norse mythology. Now, I mentioned earlier how one night in 2003 I was reading something by C.S. Lewis when an idea occurred to me. I was reading a poem he wrote called The Planets, a long, alliterative, complex poem all about the planets and how they were understood in medieval times. I get to the lines about Jupiter and Jupiter's influences, and I read this phrase: of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven and good fortune, Jove is master. 5 words from this phrase jump out at me. Winter past and guilt forgiven. Winter past and guilt forgiven. That's very like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I say to myself. The White Witch has made it always winter, never Christmas, but her kingdom of ice and snow passes at the coming of the kingdom of Aslan. And guilt is forgiven, Edmund's guilt, the treacherous Edmund who has betrayed his brother and his sisters. I look more closely at these lines connected with Jupiter, and a great deal of the imagery in the poem links up with imagery in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Most notably, kingship. Think of how Aslan is introduced in that first Narnia story. The children don't know who he is in that first book. They think he might just be a regular man. But the beavers say, no, he's not a man. He's the king of the wood. Don't you know who is the king of the beasts? He's not safe, but he's good. He's the king. Repeatedly, Aslan's kingship is emphasized. We're told that he's royal and solemn. He has a royal crown, a royal standard, a royal pavilion. He ends up crowning the children too. They become kings and queens at the end of the story, and we're told repeatedly by both Aslan and the professor, once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. The story is really a clash of disputed sovereignty between the witch and Aslan. The witch has ensnared Edmund with her promise that she wants a boy who will be prince and later on the king after she's gone. We always tend to think of the Turkish delight, don't we, in that scene. That sticks in the mind for some reason. But actually the Turkish delight is really only the bait on the hook. And what reels Edmund in is the prospect of becoming the king so that he can pay Peter back for being so beastly to him. Terrible case of sibling rivalry, this book. Peter, on the other hand, is taken by Aslan, and he's shown the castle and the 4 thrones, in one of which you, Peter, Aslan says, must sit. You will be high king over all the rest. Over all the rest, including Edmund. Edmund does indeed become a good king at the end, but only after Aslan has demonstrated true kingship in his sacrifice for Edmund's sake. Now, how does that come about? By Aslan's death and resurrection on the stone table. A very obvious, heavy-handed moral of a Sunday school lesson type that Lewis just threw in for the edification of his young readers. Yes? Got nothing to do with Jupiter, has it? Well, in the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in earnest, he published another book on the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams, one of the Inklings. And in that book, Lewis says this: when Charles Williams writes of Jupiter's red-pierced planet, Williams assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype of the divine king wounded on Calvary. This shows us that Lewis very explicitly connects jovial symbolism with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It's not just a convenient Sunday school lesson that he drops into this tale. It's an essential part of the jovial spirit, the jovial influence, which is felt throughout the tale, in the kingliness of Aslan, in the growing royalty of the children. When they put the fur coats on in the wardrobe, they looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. That's a symbol of how they are going to become regal themselves as the story progresses. We see it even in the landscape, as the land of Narnia sloughs off its wintry skin. We see it in all sorts of ornamental details, unimportant details, you might think, like the appearance of Father Christmas, that jovial character par excellence in this otherwise far too Saturnocentric century of Lewis's. Here is a medieval woodcut showing you Jupiter enthroned in the heavens, and down on earth are the people who exhibit his influence. So there on the right in the foreground you can see a coronation scene. In the middle ground on the left you can see a man kneeling for judgment. Is his guilt going to be forgiven or not? And in the background you might just be able to make out horses and hounds hunting a white stag, the white hart, the noblest quarry that kings and queens would hunt for in medieval romances. And think of the final chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the hunting of the white stag. The whole of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is irradiated with jovial influence at the large scale, at the mid scale, and at the small scale. Surely these things can't have got there by accident. But maybe they did. So let's turn on to the second book, Prince Caspian, and see how this very strangely seems to be flooded with Mars imagery. This is the martial story. Mars, as we know, is the god of war, and this is a war story. It's the civil war of Narnia, the great war of deliverance, as it's called in a later book. And if you saw the recent film version, you will remember how they went to town on the battles. But you might say there are battles in lots of the Narnia books. So what makes this especially martial? Well, it's partly the sheer centrality of those battles. It's partly that the word martial itself appears a couple of times. But what clinches it has nothing actually to do with battles or wars whatsoever, but everything to do with trees and forests. You see them here on the cover of the book. You remember how Aslan enters the story amongst dancing trees, and Lucy tries to wake the trees. The Telmarines are frightened of the forests. The trees come to the battle at the end of the book. Why all these trees? I had no knowledge of this until I began digging. But in Roman mythology, Mars was not always and only a god of war. He was originally a vegetation deity associated with trees and forests, and he was called Mars Silvanus. Here is an image of Mars from Pompeii, showing you Mars in his twin capacities as god of war, yes, with his shield, his spear, his helmet, but he's standing against a backdrop of burgeoning vegetation. The month of March, the third month of the year, is called March because it's sacred to Mars in these capacities, because in the month of March the weather is getting good enough for armies to march off to battle, but the trees are also coming back to life after winter. Here is an image from Prince Caspian showing you those two aspects of Mars in a single picture. We have the single combat in the foreground, and in the background we have the Sylvans, the Dryads, the Hammer Dryads coming to oversee the battle. And Aslan sums up this martial spirit in his own person. He's the one who utters the great war cry, summoning everyone to the final battle. He's the Lord of hosts, mighty in battle, you might say, to use biblical terminology. But he's also the one in whose presence the trees begin to move. Lucy tries to wake the trees. They will not move unless Aslan is with her, because he is the true Mars. That is to say, Lewis, by virtue of the technique of transferred classicism, reaches back into the classical past, finds there Mars, and through it says something about Christian themes. Put on the whole armor of God. Become the good soldier of Christ Jesus. The trees of the field will clap their hands. These are scriptural images which show that Lewis is turning his classical mythology to Christian effect. But he's not starting and finishing with the scripture alone. He's going all the way through classical mythology and medieval cosmology back to a scriptural conclusion enriching his theology as he goes. The children participate in these martial attributes as they get to know Aslan better and better. The boys harden into knights. The girls romp in the bacchanalian revelry with the swaying trees and the growing vines. And even seemingly unimportant details contribute to the total atmosphere, such as that little discarded chess piece that they find in the ruins of the castle at the start of the tale. What is that chess piece? Is it a bishop? Is it a pawn? Is it a king? Of course, it's a chess knight. Has to be a knight, because knighthood is the inner meaning of this story. Just as Chaucer wove the influences of knighthood into the Knight's Tale, so Lewis does the same with Mars in Prince Caspian. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the sun story. You might guess this, really, from the title alone, because this is a story about a journey towards the dawn, the place of the rising sun. And when the children meet Aslan at the eastern edge of the world, he scatters light from his mane. Lucy earlier sees him flying in a sunbeam. They come to an island with a magic pool that turns things to gold. Gold, of course, is the sun's metal. And they begin to squabble over who's going to take possession of this island. Until suddenly Aslan appears on the hillside, shaming them into silence. How is he described? Shining as if in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in. How interesting. Aslan is the light of the world. He is the true sun in this story. The gold imagery, the sun imagery, is everywhere in this tale, but what clinches it is something which has nothing on the surface to do with gold and sunshine, but everything to do with dragons. The ship itself is shaped like a dragon. Eustace is turned into a dragon. They meet the great sea serpent. Why all these dragons? Well, in Greek mythology, the god of light was Apollo, and Apollo was famously a slayer of dragons. If you know your Homer's hymn to Apollo features a famous episode in which Apollo slays a dragon, and this is a statue of Apollo slaying that miniature dragon, that lizard on the tree trunk there, with beams from his eyes. He was known as Apollo Sauroctonus, the lizard slayer, the dragon slayer. Saura is the Greek word for lizard or dragon. It's where we get the word dinosaur from, a monstrous lizard. And here is an image from the recent film version of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, showing you Eustace's eyeball after he's been turned into a dragon. And in the reflection in his pupil there, or his iris, you can just make out the approaching form of Aslan. Aslan is going to come and rip off the dragon skin and turn Eustace back into a boy again. This is not just a convenient episode depicting Christian conversion. It's part and parcel of the solar atmosphere that the whole book is designed to communicate. Let me just list for you the remaining 4 books, and then we will conclude. The Silver Chair, I believe, is the moon story. Again, you could really guess this from the title, because silver is the moon's metal. It's a tale full of wetness and wanderings and confusion and lunacy. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury tale, full of twins and language and boxing and theft and language and poetry and running. Here is Mercury, swift of foot, running through Christchurch College, Oxford. Lewis would have seen this statue on many occasions. The Magician's Nephew is the Venus story, because Venus is the creative spirit. And Narnia is created in this tale. And Diggory's mother is saved from death by a magic apple taken from the Western Garden, which is clearly modelled on the Garden of the Hesperides. The Venus imagery, the Aphrodite imagery, is everywhere in The Magician's Nephew. And the last battle, of course, is the Saturn story, because in this tale all the characters who are alive at the start of the book are dead by the end of it. This is a tale of gathering darkness and misfortune and disaster. All the planets foretell it, so Runewit the Centaur declares. And who is it who brings Narnia to an end but Father Time? Here is an image of Father Time from the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I found a typescript of an early draft of the Narnia Chronicles in which Lewis had originally called this character not Father Time, but the god Saturn. It's there in the typescript, but by the time Lewis came to publish the books, he thought, that makes it too obvious. Let's call the character Father Time. Let's bank on people not knowing that Father Time and Saturn are the same character. So if this theory is correct, why would Lewis have done it? Why does it matter? Well, it matters, I think, that we give the books their due. Credit where credit is due. These books are not a hodgepodge. They are not a mishmash. They are written with extraordinary care. It all looks planless, but all is planned. So that's the first reason for this matching. Just in sheer justice, we should recognize Lewis's skill. Why would he have done it? Two main reasons, I think, literary and theological. The literary reason we've touched on already, the kappa element in romance, the hidden atmosphere of a story, the pervasive quality or flavor. Lewis takes these 7 spiritual symbols and he uses them to color through and through each tale with its own pervasive feel. So it's not just the plot we're interested in, it's the whole feel of the world in which those events take place. That would be the literary reason for doing it, and the theological reason, of course, we've also touched upon too, because Lewis says the whole Narnia series is about Christ. But in order to portray Christ in a fully biblical fashion, Lewis must depict not just the incarnate Christ, not just Aslan, but also Aslan's spirit, the word of Aslan, so to speak, which upholds the Narnian universe. And by means of the technique of transferred classicism, turning these pagan deities into Christian symbols, Lewis can depict both aspects of Christ at the same time. The incarnate Aslan, but the spirit of Aslan, which informs every part of the story as well. Particularly the way the children interact with Aslan, so that they come to grow up into his spirit. They take on the divine attributes as they get to know him better and better. So I think it's interesting that Lewis, assuming this theory is correct, should have kept it secret. Because he knew that certain readers were going to dismiss the books as a bit of a hodgepodge. Tolkien had done so. And Lewis didn't explain himself. How interesting. But Lewis, vis-a-vis the Narnia world, is the god of Narnia, so to speak. He is its creator. And he knows what he's up to. I think Lewis wanted to give us here in Narnia an imaginative version of the situation we are faced with vis-a-vis our divine author, the creator. We look at God's purposes and we think, can they really be sound when we see accidents happen and innocent people suffering and all sorts of inexplicable events? Can there really be a divine author behind all this? Well, Lewis believed that there was a divine author behind creation, who was indeed working his purposes out, and that this universe does betray traces of intelligent design, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you. Right, so we have up to 21 minutes, I think, for Q&A. We're going to drop the guillotine at 9 o'clock at the very latest. We can go earlier if you have nothing to ask. But does anyone have anything they want to say or question about? Yes, sir.
You discussed about how Tolkien, he dismissed it as a hodgepodge. Why do you think that is, considering that, throughout Europe there's very clear pulling of paganism, throughout, every cathedral has gargoyles defending it, and Tolkien himself uses creature is taken from Norse mythology and Celtic mythology, and, falls along a very obvious, Christian theme, good versus evil story. So why do you think he couldn't get it?
Right, the question is about Tolkien and why Tolkien didn't spot what Lewis was up to. And I think the answer is that Tolkien, well, first of all, he disliked almost everything that Lewis wrote. He wasn't a very patient man. He had very narrow tastes when it came to literature. Some people, not entirely jokingly, say that even Shakespeare was too modern for Tolkien. Go through Tolkien's letters sometime, and you will find that almost every time he refers to anything that Lewis has just published or written, he's finding fault with it. The only book of Lewis's that he praises unreservedly is Out of the Silent Planet. So Tolkien was not particularly well informed about the Narnia Chronicles. He only had the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe read aloud to him. He soon gave up trying to read the books after they were published. We know that from George Sayer. And as I mentioned, he later confessed that what he knew of the books was entirely outside his range of imaginative sympathy. He thought the books were a clumsy allegory. He only had a superficial acquaintance with the books. He wasn't bothering to think or look for anything deeper. So it's no surprise at all that he missed it. I mean, I myself had been reading these books for decades before I noticed what he was up to, because, of course, your conscious mind, your contemplative mind, runs along the plot, doesn't it? You look at the events. You have to really relax into the books, fully mindful of Lewis's understanding of enjoyment consciousness, in order for it suddenly to become aware, for you to become aware of what Lewis is up to. So I'm not at all surprised that Tolkien missed it. And I'm not surprised that Lewis didn't tell him, for the very reason I've mentioned, that there's a kind of an apologetic strategy behind Lewis's secrecy on this. But also, even if you dispute that, if Lewis is wanting to get us to enjoy these 7 spiritual symbols, not contemplate them, then he couldn't tell us what he was up to, even if he had wanted to, because that would have frustrated the very thing he was trying to achieve. We are to look along these, not look at them. Now, of course, the next question that I always get asked is, well, have I not just frustrated his purposes by making this all evident? But I'm a literary critic. I'm not the author of the books. I'm entitled to do this. Lewis himself was a literary critic. Lewis himself went to Dante and Milton and Spencer and dissected their works with minutest attention to detail. Not because he thought that was an end in itself. Good literary criticism serves the book which it is analyzing, so that the reader, next time they go back to those works, can read them more intelligently, they can put more in, and therefore they can get more out. So what I have presented to you tonight, I hope will not be taken in any way as an end in itself. I have explained all this because, if you take it as reliable, next time you go to the Narnia Chronicles, you will not dismiss them as a hodgepodge. And you will begin to pick up on all the clever, brilliant ways in which Lewis floods the story with his prevailing spirit. Lewis couldn't be expected to be both author and critic at once. You've got to be one or the other. So I'm not at all surprised that he should have kept this secret. Is there a question over here? Oh no, that's a film man. David, in the front row.
Your thinking has stimulated me over time. I've heard you speak about Lewis's views about the imagination as the organ of meaning, and I just connected some dots from what you were saying, and I'd like you to comment on a couple of setups to draw it together for me and perhaps us. Lewis said at one point that he was trying to sneak past watchful dragons in baptizing the imagination of children with the spiritual, the Christian, but the spiritual effect that he was going for.
Yes.
And
So what's the question? Do you come to a question?
yes, the imagination, appealing to the imagination, and this scheme of creating a feel, an imaginative taste of this spirit, you know, that is theologically significant.
Yes.
And he also said a book that's good for children is good for adults.
Yes.
So I would just like to hear you speaking about, he's obviously got a design.
Yes, he has a design. He wants to seal past watchful progress. He says that very explicitly, that one of his purposes in writing these stories is to say something about Christianity without making it obvious. So this whole idea of circumventing conscious apprehension is indeed a major part of what he's prepared to say. But that's with regard to the obvious biblical parallels within the tales. He's not prepared even to say that much with regard to the deep planetary scheme behind the stories, because that is the DNA, if you like, of the stories. You can't even draw attention to that even casually or subtly without it beginning to cause the whole tapestry to unravel. In all my readings about Lewis and the planets, I've only discovered two possible places where he drops even a small hint about what he's up to with the planets. One is when he talks about an idea he had to try out. Why are there only 7 books, he was asked? Well, because I had an idea I wanted to try out, and after having tried it out to the full, after 7 books, it was time to stop. And he doesn't explain what this idea was. And secondly, in a letter, he drops another subtle hint. Someone wrote to him saying, I like your books, Mr. Lewis, I feel they could be laid out to form a kind of literary cathedral. And Lewis writes back to this chap saying, yes, I like that idea too. My theological treatises are the cathedral school, Miracles, Mere Christianity. They're the cathedral school. My Narnia books are really the little side chapels, each with its own little altar. Now, how interesting that he should say of the Narnia Chronicles that they each have their own little altar. It's not just one big altar dedicated to Christ. 7 little altars dedicated to Christ as the jovial king, as the martial Lord of hosts, as the solar light of the world, as the mercurial word of God, so to speak. You mentioned in your question about how planetary and cosmological symbolism informed even architecture in many ways. Lewis knew all about that, and he writes about that in the Discarded Image. How appropriate then that he should, as it were, put his own Narnia books as the side chapels of a great medieval cathedral. Yes, sir?
2, if you'd allow me.
Okay, feel quick. Yes.
1, would you give us some other works that you think are helpful to understanding Lewis better? Give us something of a bibliography. And then 2, had you not discovered this scheme, what do you think is the most compelling alternative scheme to understanding the Chronicles of Narnia as a whole? Was there anything else you felt was particularly promising in that regard?
Okay, bibliography, works by Lewis or about Lewis?
Either, if it's just insightful.
Yeah, well, I think the books I have talked about tonight are the ones I would most point you to: the Discarded Image, the Oh Hell volume, the Ransom trilogy, the Cosmic trilogy, and his poems too. His poems are often overlooked, and rather pleasingly, they've just been reissued this year in a new comprehensive edition by Don King. Do lay your hands on that if you can. His poems are full of planetary imagery all over the place.
Any secondary sources, though?
And secondary sources, well, the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis is pretty good. I say that not just because I had a hand in it, but because it's full of essays by 21 different scholars from around the world who are looking at Lewis at a very high level of investigation, both literarily, theologically, philosophically, and imaginatively. That's probably the best single version study of Lewis available. As for biographies, I would recommend the Hooper Green biography as revised by Walter Hooper in the year 2000. I think that's the best of the biographies. And then your second question was,
Was there another scheme?
Oh yes, other schemes. Well, to be honest, no. I don't think any other scheme is very plausible. I mean, I've looked at them all, the seven deadly sins, for instance. I mean, two different scholars came up with that idea independently of each other. So you might think that, oh, that has a prima facie plausibility. The only problem is that those two scholars assigned different sins to different books. So it shows you that wasn't a very reliable idea. No, I mean, these other schemes that have been suggested haven't been advanced with full seriousness. They have been advanced as a kind of convenient lens through which to look at the books, or a convenient grid that you might lay over the books. But none of these scholars has tried to pretend that Lewis had this in mind as his undergirding scheme. That's what's different about the Planet Narnia argument, that I'm actually arguing that this was in Lewis's mind very deliberately and consciously from the start. I'm not saying he had the whole 7 books mapped out ahead of time. We know that he only began with one book in mind. But he begins with his Jupiter book, because Jupiter is his favourite planet, the one that he thinks is especially in need of imaginative rehabilitation in the Saturnine 20th century. The one that he jokingly said that he himself had been born under. So he only starts out with a Jupiter book at first, but having written that, then the second and the third and the fourth gradually follow. He had written 4 of the books, actually, before he even published the first. So he did have a chance to go back and make adjustments for the sake of the series once he knew there was going to be a series. If you don't accept this planetary interpretation, I think you are forced to accept, to drop back to a view of the Chronicles, which is that they are not very carefully written, that there is no obvious pattern or scheme. I think you just have to acknowledge they are a bit of a jumble. Some scholars are prepared to do that, 1 or 2 at least, not very many. Some say there is no pattern. It's all a glorious mixture. It's like it's the brand tub mentality. There is the unity of fairyland behind it. But I don't think that gives sufficient attention to Lewis's repeated concerns about complexity and intricacy, let alone what we can show of his lifelong and deep immersion in the planetary symbols. So I think that although this argument does introduce certain new problems, for instance, could he really have kept it secret? Could Tolkien really not have noticed it? I think those problems are less problematic than the problems under the old paradigm, as it were. I think this has such explanatory power that it ought to be accepted as true, even though it introduces certain new problems. And Lewis himself argues like that with regard to Christianity in his book Miracles. He says, Christianity covers the facts better than any alternative interpretation. It introduces certain new problems. I mean, the problem of pain, for instance, is only really a serious problem, he argues, for those who believe in a loving and good God. If you don't believe in a loving and good God, does it really matter that the universe is full of pain? Why would you expect anything different? So Christianity introduces new problems, but Lewis is nonetheless content to accept it as true. This planetary scheme introduces 1 or 2 small new problems, but I'm myself content to accept it as true because it covers the remaining facts so very well. Yes, sir?
Thank you for a terrific lecture. I'm going to try and frame my question that I probably don't understand what I'm asking. So, going back to the beginning of your lecture when you talked about the shaft of light that C.S. Lewis looked at perceptive, but looking at the side of light when the light hit his face, my question trying to distill it is, did he take his characters to where that increasing knowledge of what the light when shone upon his face gave a greater reality? Did he take his characters to a greater reality of the perception of who Aslan was and the whole of creation? And where did he do that in the 7 books?
Right. I think I understand your question.
I don't.
I mean, it's very interesting that this whole point about looking at and looking along finds its own Narnian version in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Very appropriately, because the Dawn Treader is flooded with sun imagery. You remember that moment on the dark island? They come to this amorphous blackness, and they begin to sail into it, and then they find they're going round in circles, and they think they're never going to get out. Lucy, who's atop the mast, she prays a desperate prayer to Aslan. And then a beam of light falls upon the ship. Lucy looked along the beam, we're told. That very phrase from the meditation in the tool shed is there in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And what does she see along the beam? She sees an albatross flying towards her. Well, first of all, it looks like a cross, then it looks like a kite, then it looks like an aeroplane, and finally it's an albatross flying round her and speaking to her and breathing on her sweetly and saying, "Courage, dear heart." So the more that Lucy commits herself to looking along the beam, the more she sees of the reality of Aslan. Interestingly, also in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there is that scene on Coriacian's island, the island of the Dufflepuds. You remember these invisible, stupid characters? They want to be made visible. Lucy goes upstairs to read the book of spells to make invisible things visible. She utters the spell, and to her great surprise, she finds Aslan in the room with her. And Aslan says to her, "You have just made me visible." Lucy says, "Oh, don't play with me, Aslan, as if anything I can do would make you visible." "Of course you have. Don't you think I would obey my own rules?" Aslan says. Now, isn't that interesting? Aslan has been there all the time, invisibly. Now Lucy can see him. Because Aslan in this book is light, so to speak. And light is not something we see, usually. It's something we see by. So Lucy has been contemplating light while in that magician's room. Then she utters the spell, and she realizes Aslan is there. He's been there all the time, but you have just made me visible, he says. So there again you have a very clever way of playing with this theme of contemplation and enjoyment through this imagery of sunlight in the Dawn Treader.
Thank you.
You've already had a question. You, sir, with the cardigan on.
As a Christian, how do you see life along the life instead of looking at life at life?
Did everyone hear that question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I quite heard it. Could you say again, please?
Yeah. As a Christian, how do you look at life looking at it, like along the being instead of looking at life?
Right. How do you look along the Christian life rather than looking at the Christian life, I think is the question.
Yes,
Is that right? Yeah. Well, it's interesting that Lewis also uses this imagery of looking at and looking along with respect to the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. When he's talking about the Holy Spirit, Lewis says we should not think of the third person of the Trinity as someone we look at, but someone we look along. The Holy Spirit is more like eyesight than he is like anything seen. We see the effects of the Spirit, like the wind blowing the trees, but we don't know where it comes from or where it's going. The Holy Spirit is like eyesight. It's by the Spirit that we can look at Jesus and recognize him as the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Peter says. And Jesus says, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, Simon Bar-Jonah, but my Father who is in heaven. The Spirit, it's by the Spirit that we cry, Abba, Father. We have to be in the Spirit in order to look at Jesus and identify him as the Christ. Looking at Jesus and identifying him as the Christ, we can then see the Father, because he who has seen me has seen the Father, Jesus says. So there is this interplay between contemplation and enjoyment within the Trinitarian experience of a Christian. That's the best I can do in answer to your question. I think that is quite an important part of Lewis's spirituality, that we should not think of God as some kind of subject that we can get up, that we can learn, that we can look at God like we look at the railway timetable. I mean, that's religious studies. That's not Christian theology. Christian theology is about a relationship. It's knowledge by acquaintance. It's not just knowledge and facts about God that we want in our Christian lives. And it's very interesting, in the Reflections on the Psalms book that Lewis wrote, he says that coming to know God is much more like breathing an atmosphere than it is like learning a subject. I think it's very interesting that he uses this very term atmosphere for coming to know God. It's the whole of our lives. There is a holistic aspect to our knowledge of Christ, of God in Christ. It's not just one thing among others that we know when we have Christian knowledge. It's a totalizing paradigm. So it's like the atmosphere that we breathe. It's like the oxygen in this room. I mean, how many breaths in this that we have taken while we've been sitting in this room have we taken consciously? Very few. Unless you have a problem with your lungs, or unless there's smoke in the room, you're not usually aware of your breathing. It just goes on automatically all the time. Likewise with our knowledge of God, there is this subconscious or unconscious or enjoyment conscious aspect to our knowledge of God. Long before we ever start having religious thoughts or theological doctrines. But too often we think that the looking at is the more reliable or the more important kind of knowledge. It isn't so, Lewis says. There was a question just below you. Yes, sir.
Would you say something about Lewis's view of sacraments and sacramentality, sacramental way of thinking? You talked about inhabiting the light that you're looking through, and it sounds kind of sacramental to me.
Yes, it is rather sacramental. The question is about Lewis's view of sacramentality, and he had a high view of the sacraments. He was an Anglican, so he only believed in 2 sacraments, not the 7 that Catholics believe in. But he certainly believed in what you might call a sacramental understanding of nature, that God is to be discerned in and through the things he has made. That is a very incarnational view of understanding Christianity, that God likes matter, he invented it, as he puts it in Mere Christianity. There are all sorts of sensory experiences that Lewis himself had. Enjoyment of music, enjoyment of beautiful views of nature, enjoyment of personal relationships. Concrete, sensible experiences, which he felt communicated to him something of the divine. But as he says in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, the fatal mistake is to think that the divine is in these things. Actually, it comes through these things. We must think of these things as iconic, like stained glass. The light streams through them and brings them to life. We must not cut off the light at the stained glass, because then it will all go dead and cold in our hands. The beauty that we find in these images, he says, is not in them, it comes through them. So that is a very sacramental way of looking at nature, and that's part and parcel of Lewis's whole quest for joy that he writes about in Surprised by Joy. When he realizes that no earthly sensation, no earthly concrete experience can contain the joy, well, then he realizes that there is this transcendence, there is this holiness, there is this other with a capital O, which is best described as God. But just because God is transcendent doesn't mean that he isn't also immanent. God is closer to us than any other thing, Lewis says, but also he is further away from us than any other thing. This is one of the values he found in the theology of Richard Hooker. He talks about this in his 16th century volume. God is unspeakably immanent, but also unspeakably transcendent. And you need to retain both poles of that doctrine for a really securely grounded Christian theology. If you only have the transcendence, then you tip over into a kind of docetic Christianity, in which Christ only appears to be human, but isn't really. And if you have too much of an emphasis on the immanence of God, then you tip over into a sort of Arian heresy, where Christ is not truly God, but he's much more like a slightly superman. But true Christian theology unites earth and heaven. Christ is the true Jacob's ladder, stretching between earth and heaven, providing the bridge on which the angels ascend and descend. It's past 9 o'clock. We ought to stop. Thank you very much.